Next up is the Clerk of the House of Representatives. And you might recognise this face to those who watch Parliament TV.
Come up. Not very often we have the Clerk of the House before the Select Committee. So just acknowledge that. So you've got 10 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. And yeah, I don't often appear as a witness before committees, but when I do, it's usually making a submission on a bill that I have significant concerns about in relation to Parliament. And this is one of those bills. So at the outset, just make it clear that I don't have a position on whether the term should be 3 or 4 years. That's really first for Parliament and then for the voting public to decide. What my concerns about some of the effects this bill is likely to have on Parliament, some of them which might be unforeseen. Let's start with the bill's objectives. So one of its key ones is to improve lawmaking, but the bill's provisions don't really seem to address that in a clear way. In particular, the legislative effect isn't directly connected to that particular aim, and I think there are some potential adverse effects on Parliament's lawmaking function. I'm sure other submissions will mention the uncertainty about the maximum term of Parliament. I think it's undesirable for people to not know how long the Parliament's going to be. There's the potential for the restriction or abrogation of the House's right to control its own proceedings. The statutory imposition of a model for Select Committee membership could lead to both procedural tactics to circumvent that and reduced legislative quality following its implementation. And those are the things I'd like to focus on in the submission, and then I'd be happy to take any questions. So the first one about the variable term, as introduced, the bill would create uncertainty. The term could be 3 to 4 years. We would only know after the election which of those two it was going to be, which would mean that both voters and candidates during the election wouldn't know how long the term was going to be. That could affect how parties make policy proposals to the electorate and how they'd be costed. And it does mean that people couldn't answer that simple question, as just been mentioned, how long is the term of Parliament in New Zealand? In terms of parliamentary privilege, the bill would provide a statute for aspects of the House's own rules and practice, which would mean the House could no longer determine these things for itself, and that is an abrogation or limitation of Parliament's privilege of exclusive control of its proceedings. It's usually something I caution against. One of the reasons is the effects of changes to Parliament's rules can be somewhat unpredictable or unknowable. The model we use of the Standing Orders Committee reviewing those rules every 3 years means that if there are any unforeseen results from changes that have been made, they can be reviewed and changed again, and that is done by convention, done unanimously. If parliamentary rules are set out in statute, they can only be changed by statute, and really that relies on the government to initiate that change. So you move away from that unanimity approach to one that really is government initiated, because everyone here knows it's difficult for a member's bill to have the same sort of effect or even get selected. The particular policy changes suggested around basing the term of Parliament on how Select Committees are constituted. That idea of how Select Committees are constituted was dealt with in the Standing Orders Committee in 2023. One of the ideas submitted to it was essentially the same proportionality requirement as is in this bill, and the proposal wasn't adopted by the Standing Orders Committee at that time. Bearing in mind that's an all-party committee that reaches decisions by consensus, the committee said at that time that the proposal might undermine the Select Committee system's performance of its legislative function, which is widely considered to be a strength of the current system. So this bill would effectively impose that model despite the Standing Orders Committee's misgivings. And that's certainly something the House can do, but I would say that you should think seriously about the likely impacts that would have. And I think the potential impact on legislative quality, as I said, the explanatory note says that improving lawmaking is a key objective of this bill. It's not really clear how this bill would drive that. Nearly all bills refer to select committees. Committee members, although there's always policy disagreements, committee members generally work collegially to try and improve legislation, and so they add value to the lawmaking process. And these existing strengths, I think, should be borne in mind when thinking about making any changes. One of the risks is that if select committees were primarily opposition dominated, government legislative proposals might not proceed, or they might end up with a wide range of recommendations from the opposition-led committee that the government doesn't support. What we could then see is that those recommendations are not adopted at second reading. They could be voted down, or if they are, that the government uses its majority in committee of the whole House to make wholesale substantive changes, and that is a bad way of making law. It's far better for the select committee, which has the benefit of being able to talk to people, talk to experts, hear evidence, and actually spend some time on its recommendations. It's far better for that to be the place that substantive changes are made than a committee of the whole House, which has none of those advantages. At present, departmental officials in the Parliamentary Council are made available by the Attorney General and Ministers to assist committees. Whether they would be so willing to do that if committees were opposition dominated and not cooperating in the progression of the government's legislative programme would be something that would need to be considered. I can't speak for them and say it wouldn't happen, but it is a risk that doesn't currently arise. And I did want to spend a bit of time talking about some of the procedural tactics that could be used to, get around the proportionality requirement in the bill. So after an election, opposition parties could choose not to agree to an arrangement that would give the government a 4-year term in office. That would mean the Business Committee then couldn't establish the membership of select committees, meaning the government would need to do it in the House by motion on notice. And the government has a majority and it can do that. What that could lead to, though, is a reduction in the number of overall seats in committees, to reduce the size of the non-government majority on committees, or putting a lot of opposition members on a few committees, so that you reduce the number on which they have a majority. After the term has been determined, there's no going back once that's happened, so long as the conditions are met. Select committee membership can be altered by motion on notice. More ministers or undersecretaries could be sworn in. Now, there is a price to pay in answering to the public for doing those things, but they are possible. A government could use its majority to establish additional select committees that are not subject to select committees and refer as much of its legislation to those as it wants to. It could refer all bills only to committees that don't have an opposition majority. Bills might circumvent the select committee process entirely, which is always undesirable, but urgency bypasses that, and it may be seen as less desirable if government bills are not going to be supported through the committee in the same way that they are now. I guess on the other side, opposition-dominated committees could also frequently initiate more partisan inquiries than happen now. So I'm not suggesting any of the parties represented at the table would do that after the next election, but they are things just to be aware of. They're all possible. There are ways to work around the requirement, and I do think the proportionality requirement really needs to be separated from whether we should have a 3 or 4 year term. They're both ideas we're thinking about, just not together. What I'd suggest instead is that the House develop a package of procedural changes in preparation for a 4 year term, if that's something that is going to be tested at a referendum. As I've said, the Standing Orders Committee operates by consensus. It reviews the Standing Orders every 3 years, and the development of procedural changes in tandem with a bill is an established process. The New Zealand Bill of Rights Declarations of Inconsistency Amendment Bill went through a select committee. At the same time, the Standing Orders Committee developed the parliamentary rules changes that were needed to support that, and then the two were ultimately debated together in the House to show that they would work together. So there's lots of possibilities. Standing Orders Committees had some of these recommended before, but a greater requirement for the government to consult on policy development, for example, could be a requirement. The use of urgency could be curbed. There could be rules for non-government members to chair particular committees like finance and expenditure. The opposition could lead scrutiny activity. There could be a committee created to focus on legislative scrutiny. There's lots of things that could be done to improve lawmaking and to adjust to a 4 year term. And I certainly think there's a strong argument that if you do have a 4 year term, surely there is a lesser need to pass law under urgency unless it's truly urgent. So these are things that could be considered in parallel with the bill about a 4 year term, or about a referendum on a 4 year term. And I think that would be a better alternative. My submission concludes by talking about the requirements for a special majority or a referendum in relation to a clause in this bill. I don't need to cover that with you. I just thought I'd include it for completeness. I guess in conclusion, I'd say I think the bill should be amended to provide for the possibility of a 4 year term if that's supported at a referendum. I think it should be amended by deleting all the provisions related to the term of Parliament being contingent on the proportionality of select committee membership. And for the Standing Orders Committee, I think if this is going to proceed, it should develop a package of reforms that would work in a 4 year term. Okay. So that's my submission. I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you. We've only got a couple of seconds. I think we've only got time for one question. Mr. Rutherford, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, how often does the clerk make submissions to select committees on bills that select committees are considering?
Probably twice a Parliament, something roughly like that, 2 or 3 times.
Because one of the points in the submission, and you raised it there, was aside from the question of whether in principle voters should be faced with such uncertainty, the variable term could affect the ability of parties and candidates to prepare and communicate their policy platforms and the fiscal commitments involved. I'm just not aware of how that relates to the business of the clerk versus what the committee is considering.
I'm not sure I understand.
I struggle to understand how something like that relates to the work that the clerk does in preparing a submission to the committee.
Well, I thought it was a relevant factor in my submission. That's why it's part of the work. I might be missing something.
That's fine.
Well, I think the question is, are you here as submitting as a clerk of the House, or are you here in a personal capacity as well?
Oh, well, if I can answer that question clearly, I'm submitting as the clerk of the House. I'm clerk of the House letterhead and signed as clerk of the House.
Okay. All right. Unfortunately, we haven't got any more time.
It was really a procedural question, if I may, Chair.
Well, just very quickly.
Given the role of this submitter, is it possible to bring them back out of when we've heard some of the other submissions?
Okay. We'll address that as a committee, but hey, thank you, Dr. Wilson. Very helpful.
Okay,
right. Okay. Let's go through. We've now got.
How do you think that one went? Learned a lot?
Yeah. Yeah, still processing. That's what I mean. I get a bit lost when people just complain about government, because everything I hear is that there's a lot of thought going into what's going on. Don't panic.
Submissions from was it the clerk of the House?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean he's on parliamentary procedure. He's probably the most expert one out there that we could have. Him and his deputy Seuss Jones. And I mean they've both been concurrently in the role for I think since like 2011 or something, or 2012. Okay. Yeah, like I've dealt with Seuss Jones a really long time ago, and they both are still in there. It's but they've basically been running the show at Parliament for years. Sorry about that with on the select committee on that one, Jeff. And the issue is I sped this up pre-production, and I can't slow it down. Unfortunately, the way it is, but this is set up so that when Laura runs it, her computer don't crash.
And if anyone's watching it later, they can slow it down, or you can at least
post-production clips. You can adjust the setting of the speed, and we've got no problem if you sit there and do that. I mean, we've got a limited time frame to fill it in. Let's get off to the next submission.